Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about 7 projects, and I just wanted to sort of start by mentioning my background was with people who made things. So it was lovely seeing Martino's talk and his engagement with making things, and how there's a spirit that you can feel when people are interested in how things are made. And let me just. And when it comes to buildings, it feels that in the world of building design, that spirit of making has somehow evaporated in the triumph of modern procurement of buildings, and also in some of the values that are celebrated. And in my studio's work, where we have a team of over 200 people, we are trying to think from the human dimension and in some way trying to fight against the soullessness that so often exists in the world around us. In the new buildings that I experienced as a little tiny Thomas going around the world, I would look and just couldn't understand why so many new building projects were so sterile and didn't feel like they cared about the place where they were from. And it's incredible what globalization has given us and the digital revolution, but it has also had some consequences that mean that many places in the world, as they develop and get more buildings and more places are created, become more and more similar to everywhere else. And so we're very interested in the idiosyncrasy and particularity and trying to be amplifiers of distinctiveness. And we cherish when we find things that are really particular. And so when I visited the Korean Furniture Museum, it was special to see the unique things about that form of architecture that were particular to Korea, with your crazy climate of crazy heat and crazy cold. And one of those that really stuck in my mind, we now have in our studio, and on our top shelf. And it was this mystery object here that I saw in the Korean Design Museum, and I was thinking, what is that thing? It's beautiful. Then when I discovered that it's a bamboo wife, just thought it was such a beautiful name as well. And so we were striving in some way with our own projects to try to find things that can feel like they are particular to their places. And so one of those, the first of the 7 things I was going to show, in Singapore, we were commissioned to make a new university building in the heart of the campus. And this building needed to go here and have 57 tutorial rooms. And the interesting thing with the digital revolution that happened was that of the last 20 years, that you don't need to go to university anymore because you can stay in bed and get a PhD. And so then, talking with the professors, the question was, why do you need to go to university at all? And they said, well, you come to university to meet people. And so the existing university had so many spaces like this, which are the least likely place that you want to meet someone. No daylight, polystyrene ceiling tiles, and our building needed to be a 24-hour building. And so you thought, well, would you send your 17-year-old son or daughter at 3 o'clock in the morning down 3 miles of these weird corridors? So we were trying to think, instead of a university that divided people, could we make a university that brings people together in this new age where you can study at home? The university must be a place to bring people together. And that is something that, in a way, is common to a number of the projects I will show today. The professors also said they didn't want the master and servant relationship between the guru, who stands at the front, and the slaves who bow before learning. And they said, we want you to learn together in the round. So they said, no corners. So we obeyed them, and our classrooms had no corners. So we put together 12 of these, and then we made lots of spaces, nooks and crannies. I don't know if nook and cranny will translate into Korean, but it's spaces with no defined function, deliberately ambiguous. But then we had a budget that was only a little bit more than for a car park to build this with. And so we realized that we could only use concrete for the floors. We could only use concrete for the walls and the stairs and the elevator cores and the cladding because we wanted to meet Green Mark Platinum, which is the highest environmental performance certification, and also the construction regulations in Singapore. You get this buildability score, and to get that, the outcome was the only material we could use was concrete. And in the UK, the association with concrete is very negative. And so we were trying to think, how can we love concrete? And so when speaking to the engineers, it was clear, and in my mind, it was like ceramic. And once we were thinking, well, we're making a building from ceramic, then it felt special again. And this is just large ceramic that you don't need to fire. And why did it need to be cold and hard? So we found out that we had 1 inch of love we could give the surface of the concrete to affect the surface and not just have it dead flat. And because our budget was so low, we also knew it would be very bad concrete, because the cheapest concrete, the best concrete, the sort of Japanese amazing Tadao concrete, where it's perfectly smooth, is very expensive. So it was clear ours would have lots of bubbles and stones and holes and problems. So we thought, well, how could we love all of those? So we tried to use our 1 inch of love. So with the columns, we needed 58 columns. So we made a mold where the column just slightly changed so that every column had undulations on it, in a way the size of human bellies, so hopefully you might touch them. We also worked with an artist who did 700 ink drawings, which we embedded 3-dimensionally into the surface of all the cores. And this meant that we would then have a bigger idea than the staining and holes and bubbles in the concrete, to try to make those imperfections not matter. So the finished building is not one building, it's actually 12 buildings that come together. And because it is a 24-hour building, it doesn't need a door. The whole thing has 12 doors. It's porous all the way around. And it's tropical weather, and so the air blows through and ventilates it. And now the building has been going for 4 years. I went back recently, and we had designed it so that these towers stopped at different heights so we could put gardens in, and deliberately try to make spaces which would allow people to stay and linger. And so now the gardens are now growing over and taking their own life of the building, which we intended, at all the nooks and cranny spaces, which have these planters here. And the edges on the interior were designed to allow you to stop and speak and linger, not to just rush and hurry round the project. And so it has a social job separate from the formal learning. I've got too many slides here, but I couldn't choose which ones to kick out, so because I got them yesterday. So, but in a number of our projects, we felt strongly that there is how could we integrate nature? Because however great you think you are as a designer, any design, the fixed nature of the solidity of that architecture, the inclusion of things that are growing and changing and beyond your control, feel like they are a necessary antidote to whatever decisions you might have made in the actual architecture itself, just as the people in the buildings give the true life and completion to any project you're working on. So, sticking on the subject of concrete, last year we finished a project in Cape Town in South Africa, and there we had a very large concrete structure made from gigantic concrete tubes, and this had been the tallest building in sub-Saharan Africa for half a century, and it was a grain silo. And we were being asked to turn this into Africa's first ever museum for contemporary African artists. And it seemed fascinating to us that the world has gone modern art crazy, and Europe and Asia and North America have thousands of contemporary art museums now, and the whole of Africa didn't have one major institution that an African artist could show their work. And Africa, as you know, is as big as Europe and North America combined. So we had a very low budget, but we had a sense of importance in our stomach that we must make something work. But we were told very clearly that tubes are rubbish for showing art in. And this building had over 100 tubes, circular tubes where the grain was stored, rectangular tubes, square tubes, and grain was even stored in the cruciform spaces between the circular tubes. And something that you'll see repeating in a few of our projects is that my experience, and as something we discuss a lot in the studio, is it's more important than ever to make spaces that bring people together, because so much architectural space from the past divides us, and because it wasn't so necessary to bring people together. And the challenge we had with this project was that we could knock down that building and we could build a new spaceship that had landed in South Africa, but the risk was that somebody would come and have their photograph taken with the outside and buy a postcard and go home and not go in, because in that part of Africa, people aren't used to going to museums at all, let alone a modern art museum. So our challenge seemed to be not the outside, but the inside. How could we make a compelling interior so that people didn't worry about whether they know about modern art or not, but they felt compelled that they should go inside. So we became very interested in how we could make a heart to the structure, which could be the heart that helped you not get lost with the 80 galleries, but also maybe make someone who would not go into an art museum otherwise, maybe, just maybe, go inside. And so the thing that was interesting about the tubes was we were being told, get rid of the tubes. And we wanted to keep the spirit of the tubes because there was something unique. And in all our projects, we're trying to not have a single studio style, but to try to grow a project particular for each place. And so the thing with tubes was that we were trying to save them, and it felt if we cut them in a curve with a curving plane, tubes do something interesting. And so when we were thinking about the shape of that atrium, the obvious thing was to cut through with a rectangle of space. But we managed to get hold of one of the original grains of corn that had been stored in the building for 90 years. trillions of grains of corn had gone through these tubes. And we got one, and we got a digital computer scanning machine, and we scanned it to get the exact shape of that grain of corn. And then we enlarged that grain in our computers till it was 10 stories high. And then our idea was to cut that out of the heart of the building to make a true heart space, and then wrap around it 80 galleries that you could visit. So this was our computer rendering of the project from 5 years ago, and then construction began, and we managed to take that magnolia horrible paint off the outside of the concrete and then exposed that the concrete was not grey, it was very warm, and it felt like Petra, and as if it was natural sandstone. And we, in the context of the buildings around that are very shiny and very flat and maybe more internationally familiar, this had a quality that was unique to that place. And from the stones that were quarried from Table Mountain, where there used to be stone quarries. And then there was the process of cutting through and exposing these tubes. And concrete after 1 century is extremely hard at its maximum cure and very brittle. So cutting through it was very difficult. But we wanted to keep all the unusual parts of this, that if you were building a new building, you would never be able to persuade anyone to let you build. So this is the finished museum sitting in the waterfront. From the top, you can see where Nelson Mandela was kept prisoner on Robben Island. So with the outside, we cut open the structure and put in these windows. And most of our work with the project, though, was restoration, was restoring the concrete, but trying to let all the imperfections stay there, not over-restore it, and restoring these track sheds. So we cut open the structure and put in these windows. And then on the top, these act as a windbreak, and this is the glass that is above the tubes inside. So this is the finished atrium space. And so the spiral staircase, in a way, became like a drill bit that had drilled the center of one of these tubes. And the elevators were designed to have no top on, so that you can see up as you go through. And as you can see, the same piece of grain cut through the square tubes as well as the circular tubes. And that's the people on the top. And this is the entrance of the museum, and you come underneath the hoppers. These are the taps where the corn used to drop onto the conveyor belts and get taken out to go onto the ships. And this is the view from above that those babies were getting. And this is the view when you look up the elevator. And these were some of the other nooks and crannies in between the tubes when you walk along to where the elevators are. But this concrete never thought it would be exposed. So you would see the different moments where they poured the concrete on different days and the different kinds of stone they used as they were mixing the concrete. With most of the structure, we tried to keep the lightest touch and, if possible, just dust and do nothing more. And we were blessed with the heritage that existed there already, and our job was just to try to amplify the idiosyncrasy, and we were blessed with the soul that the building already had. There's a family of different galleries of different sizes. and that's the terrifying view. And it's also being used for performance. I thought I would just now talk about the challenge of building new, and how do you try to have particularity and character when something is new. And we have been designing the new headquarters buildings for Google in collaboration with a New York-based architect called Bjarke Ingels. And our challenge was that Google, as this mighty company sitting in Silicon Valley, in the relics of where there used to be thousands of companies from the 1970s, many of whom are no longer there. But now the valley has been taken up with a new mix of companies, with Apple in Cupertino, Intel in Santa Clara, Yahoo in Sunnyvale, Facebook in Palo Alto, but Google is in Mountain View. And our job was to try to make, for the first time, workspace, because they were growing and needing 5,000 new workspaces every year. And they'd run out of the buildings from the old companies. And it was quite astonishing when we first went 6 years ago to find that the valley where some of the most incredible products in our lives were created by some of the most brilliant people, how rubbish it was, in fact, and in physical terms, architecturally. And there were the old little buildings, and they had been taken over and used, but there were cars everywhere, there was tarmac everywhere, and every building was surrounded by car parks. And so suddenly and then even companies like Google had taken over old leased office spaces and tried to make them their own. And we'd got used to the idea that companies like this would come in and put a crazy slide and a fun stuff. And in a way that had been very copied. But still, even companies like Google and Apple have now built their own headquarters, and so have Facebook. But at that time, 6 years ago, no one had physically manifested what they were like into their own workspace fully. And so we had a company that was mighty, very mighty, and known by everybody for the sort of majesty of the power of the search, or Google Earth, or some of the other companies that they've created, but very new to physicality. And so the question was, how would they become physical and touch the world? And do we make office space in that mode of it's very different making an office which has got 100 people to a building that has 4,000 people in it. And how do you make that workspace when the spirit is to be engineers? And so we started by thinking that we really wanted to try to connect people more to nature and daylight. And in some sense, a key thing that chimed with the leaders of Google was, how could you make it feel like a place of engineering and making? This is a photograph of our studio, and we were just trying to think, how can you scale up the spirit of a studio rather than an office? And the key seemed to be that, so this is Mountain View here that we're next to, but here Google had bought the lease for the Moffett airfield. This is NASA's airfield. And on NASA's airfield were these 3 airship hangars. And when we looked at them, these were built and actually never properly used, but these spectacular structures that were supposed to be used for the future of airships, which then sort of died out at the Second World War. But it felt, when we spoke to them and said, well, actually, you want a hangar because you're working on such a huge range of initiatives, you would feel better working in a hangar. So our challenge became to be, how could we make working hangars for their engineers? And so what we looked at was whether, if we could make large spanning, very flexible building space, we could treat the interiors as furniture, large-scale furniture, and then have a piece of landscape. And these three things come together, but where the challenge seemed to be the old buildings were not very flexible. So could we make, the spirit of a hangar is extreme flexibility. So, and we don't know how people will be working in another 20 years or 30 years. Though when you speak to Google, one of the main things they'll say, well, we won't be here anyway, we'll be in space, which just ruins trying to do design. So our plan, our master plan, involves a number of these structures across the Bay Area of Mountain View. But the challenge seemed to be, and this is what we try to do in our buildings as well, and this was one of Google's focal things, was focus on the user and all else will follow. And so we just tried to start our design work thinking about, so one of the buildings has 3,000 people in it. So we're saying, well, if we've got these 3,000 people, can we see if we break that down into team sizes, and so we create these teams, and then we make these almost like a patchwork of these spaces, like a neighborhood. And we put these all together, but then those are still on one plane. If we then lift that up, what that allows us to do is to take all the meeting rooms, event spaces, cores, cafes, and toilets, all those other different functions where you don't necessarily need the best daylight, and put those underneath. And then, having done that, we can then lift up these different plates to differing heights. So this becomes a gentle pyramid of these steps, so that each team has its own plate. Because one of the things which allows people to all have a view out to the bay, but one of the things when we were looking at the existing office space, the daylight was terrible. So we were trying to think how every single person in Google working in these buildings could have perfect daylight. So by lifting these and pulling them apart, we then create a whole collection of courtyards. Then each of these courtyards has a different staircase so that they all are memorable to know where they all are. And then each of those courtyards then has its own artworks, planting, installations, temporary spaces, and creations. And then you have the teams inhabiting that. Then we throw in, like chopsticks, all of the columns, and then we take a skin of photovoltaic. So this is solar panel skin of the whole building. And then we cut open daylight. So we have daylight coming in from the sides in clerestory windows. And so the whole of the skin generates the electricity needed by that building, and we need no additional electricity. And we collect the rainwater from that, and then the landscape goes through. So in a sense, we've got the roof is like the clouds because we can get incredible ceiling heights, and then the furniture is a bit like the Burning Man festival. Underneath that, you have a world which is almost like a Medina, and then you have the landscape that flows through. So these ingredients all coming together. So at the moment, we have 4 of these buildings in construction in Mountain View. Over here next to the bay, and over here at a place called Charleston East. And so this is one of the models of what we're constructing. So these are the solar panels. This was a model we showed at the Royal Academy of Art in London. But this shows you the ceiling height inside. You sometimes get 20 meters. I mean, it's really fantastic working space. And at the moment, the frames are all just starting to go up. So in the next year and a half, these will start to complete. So the challenge then, working with Google, was what do we do when you come to London, when you don't have that space? And this is where our studio is, just here, in King's Cross in London. And just round the corner is King's Cross Station and St Pancras Station. And this is where the train to Paris, the Eurostar, goes from. And there's a new development here, and I'm going to talk about 2 buildings from it. The first is our headquarters building for Google that we've been designing. And this building, the challenge was that it's longer than King's Cross Station. It's too big. In a way, so the soulfulness issue is a very big issue, because when a building is in a normal street, you would have many buildings. When the entire street, rooms, kitchens, toilets, but that meant that we have triple height glass. So people sitting even very deep into the building, there's daylight coming in all the way inside. Our site also changes level. So that could allow us to access from a workspace with daylight into the support spaces. So in effect, our building, this is the ground level, and then we're lifted up 2 stories, and there is the first slab. Then there's triple height space, and this is temporary. So this can shift and change so that this building can still be flexible and used in a century from now in the same way that some of the old industrial buildings work so well. So the main thing with this, the bigger building, is that this has a timber facade. So it's a wooden facade, and this will be the biggest use of wood in London on the facade of a building. So these are triple height pieces of timber, and so they will age over time, which we hope will be special. And then we're also creating a roofed garden for the workers there, and occasionally the public will also be able to go and share that and be there too. But the ground is still in development, so we're still working on that to get that how we want. So now I've just got 2 more things to show, which was also, so my studio is over here again. This is where that Google building is. But here we were commissioned to design a shopping heart for King's Cross. And there were these 2 old warehouse buildings where the trains used to come on viaducts and drop coal onto the horses and carts, onto the carts pulled by the horses that gave the coal to London to heat up the houses. And we were asked to turn it into the shopping heart. The length is the same length as St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So these are very long. And the challenge was that we have worked on retail projects before, but I think people had imagined that this was like Covent Garden in London, where you could just clean the bricks, historic, lovely Victorian architecture, and put some shops in, and then it would be good, like Covent Garden. But actually, the distances are all wrong. It's too wide apart. So we felt the brief was not correct for the project. And we were trying to think how we could make a heart to the project, because the distance from here to here was 39 meters. In a shopping mall, the distance might be 13 meters, because that distance is enough that you might look, see something, and then still be interested, whereas 39, you're more likely to go home, think, I don't need swimming trunks, I'm going home. And so here we felt that 2 floors also was not going to work. We needed a 3rd floor. So we were looking at ideas to how we could connect the 2 buildings. And this was just a quick thing that we worked with the city planners. And the city planners made our design get better. And actually this man, was the urban designer, and he was not happy with our early designs. And normally people like to hate the city planners, but actually he made a good point, and his clarity helped us redesign the project. And so we then we had felt that we needed a 3rd floor of space, and we're not experts at feng shui, but 2 broken sticks. Where do you meet your granny or your girlfriend? Like, what's going on? And so we felt there needed to be a 3rd floor and something that made you know where the center spirit was. So we also needed a new roof. So our design developed to take this existing roof and grow it across and use this stone that originally was on the roof, but use it in a different way. And use the creation of that to make a focus and weather protection. And Central St Martin's Art School is next door to this. And so the art school can use this space for fashion shows. And there is a space looking out over London in a different way. But trying to grow something particular to London and particular to those structures. And it's about stitching together the old with a newer element rather than being scared of the old and putting always the solution being a box. And it felt in this context that wasn't necessary. So this is opening in a month from now in London. So at the moment there is a lot of construction work that's been going on. And so on October the 26th, it opens. And this is the first time I've shown these pictures. I took them last week. And so I've run out of time, so I'm going to very quickly zoom to what we're working on at the moment. So I'm not going to show you this project that's called 1,000 Trees that I'd like to show you, which we're constructing in Shanghai. So pretend you haven't seen this. And I'll talk about this next time. And it's 1,000 Trees and the concrete and structures. And the final thing I was just going to show is what we're working on now. And this, in terms of soullessness and soulfulness, we won the competition together with an architect from New York called KPF to design Singapore's new airport, Terminal 5, which is as big as Changi Airports 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, so this is Changi Terminal 5. And this piece of land is 1/70th of the whole landmass of Singapore. And we're used to big airports. And so once again, our challenge is how do we create the human scale within crazy, non-human monster massiveness? And how can you use materials? Because humans, we are the same size we were 1,000 years ago or 2 million years ago. But the buildings have got bigger and bigger. And so often you feel quite dead, even though the design would look good on a postcard. So this is our adventure at the moment. They've won each year the best airport of the year for 6 years running because the leaders are interested in the human scale. He never looks younger or older in any year. But so the airport capacity has to double to 150 million because of this, this space. So how can you cater for millions of people but also be human and have some feeling that connects with people's inside somehow? And that's what we're working on at the moment. And hopefully, if I ever come back again for another Herald Design Forum, I'll be able to start showing you where we're going. But we feel nicely scared to try to get that right. Thank you.